Rise up!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. I'm your host, Jess Root, from cardswire.com, the USA Today NFL Wire site dedicated to your Arizona Cardinals. And this edition, episode 311, is the first of our 2021 opponent preview shows. So we will not have Seth Cox as we normally would have. He gets the weeks off while I record these. And in this edition of the show, we will talk to editors or contributors to the wire sites for the Arizona Cardinals' first three opponents of the seasons. In week 1, the Tennessee Titans; week 2, the Minnesota Vikings; and week 3, the Jacksonville Jaguars. So let's kick things off and enjoy the show, starting off with our week 1 opponent, the Tennessee Titans. Welcome to the show, Mike Moritas from TitansWire.com, the site editor for our sister site. Mike, how are you? And thank you for coming on the show.
I'm doing good, man. Thanks for having me.
So let's kind of look back. The Titans, who have been, I guess, quietly very good the last 2 years, even though, and if there's a quarterback who has sort of, if there is one underrated quarterback in the league, it's hard to underrate any quarterbacks anymore, but I'd have to say Ryan Tannehill fits that bill perfectly, because no one talks about Ryan Tannehill, and then he goes and he puts up numbers and wins games. And even though all the credit goes to Derrick Henry, Tannehill's been pretty dang good for you guys, hasn't he?
Oh, I mean, he's been fantastic. I mean, and the slander in the wake of the Julio Jones trade, the Ryan Tannehill slander, was just out of control. I mean, this guy, I don't know what else he has to do for people to consider him, you know, at least an above average quarterback. You know, it's always kind of poo-pooing, you know, Ryan Tannehill, you know, he's nothing special. Listen, he's a perfect fit in this offense, great with the play action. You know, he can hit the deep balls when he needs to hit them. And, you know, really, I mean, a lot of people credit, you know, their former offensive coordinator, Arthur Smith. They credit Derrick Henry for Ryan Tannehill's success. But when you go back to 2019 in those first 6 games when Tannehill wasn't the starter, that offense was doing nothing. You know, Arthur Smith was on track to being fired. I mean, they had one of the worst offenses in the NFL. Derrick Henry wasn't putting up big numbers those first 6 games. And then you go to week 7, Tannehill takes over. Well, he took over halfway through week 6. Week 7 is his first start. And from then on through last year, they've had one of the best offenses in the NFL. So the proof is in the pudding. I make the argument that Ryan Tannehill made Arthur Smith and not the other way around. Derrick Henry, not so much. You know, I mean, he could really do his own thing. But even Henry's numbers before Tannehill took over were not that great in 2019. So he deserves a lot more credit than he's gotten.
So let's take it back to the 2020 season, where they finished 11-5, winning. They finished 11-5, made the postseason, was a quick exit in the postseason. Look back at that year. What went well? What were the successes, and what were the disappointments in the 2020 season for the Tennessee Titans?
Well, their offense was obviously elite. I mean, they really leaned on their offense during the regular season because the defense provided no resistance. I mean, they were historically bad on third down defense. They couldn't cover. Their run defense got worse. They couldn't sack the quarterback. They had the 3rd fewest sacks in the NFL and one of the lowest totals in NFL history for a team that made the playoffs. So their defense was just putrid. And the offense really carried them to 11 wins. If their offense wasn't as good as it was, if it was even a step below what it was, they might not make the playoffs. And, you know, they finished with the same record as the Colts. They just had a better divisional record. So they got in through tiebreaker. But when you go to the playoff exit, it was kind of the opposite. You know, the defense did enough. They allowed 20 points, but the offense couldn't get anything going. You know, Derrick Henry got shut down, and the passing game wasn't able to carry them through that game. And to make matters worse, AJ Brown wasn't fully healthy. Corey Davis got hurt about midway through the game, so he wasn't even out on the final drive of the game. So it was a weird reversal of fortune there in the sense that the offense was actually the reason why they got bounced from the playoffs early rather than the defense.
It was a disappointing end to the season, though I will say, looking back at some of those games last year, they were some doozies. I mean,
oh yeah, I mean they were such an exciting team to watch, and as horrible as it was to watch the defense, the offense was just. I mean, it was like playing Madden on easy mode. You know what I mean? They were just scoring at will, big plays. Derrick Henry running for 2,000 yards. They are really one of the more exciting offenses to watch because they have just multiple guys that can make big plays that are exciting to watch. And then you add Julio Jones on top of that. It puts them on another level.
So, getting back to Tannehill, would it have been different had he cracked the 4,000-yard mark? Because it feels like his season was fantastic. He had over 3,800 passing yards, 33 touchdown passes, 7 interceptions. His passer rating was over 106, which is just incredible. Sacked 24 times last year. Add to that, he does have as well some athleticism. So he does actually add a little bit. He also ran for 7 touchdowns. It gives him 40 total touchdowns on the year. Would it have been different in terms of perspective on Tannehill had he cracked that 4,000-yard mark? Because we do know it's a passing lead, and when you have a dynamic back, like an elite back, not just dynamic, but just special back in the backfield like Derrick Henry, he is going to get the credit, especially when your quarterback is not a name. Would it have been different if he'd gotten 4,000 yards, having the kind of the base of the good passing production?
I mean, possibly. I mean, but then again, he threw for 4,000 yards, I think more than once when he was with the Dolphins. That didn't help him out too much as far as, what the opinion is of him out there. But yeah, I mean, when you hit those kind of special markers, milestone numbers, it always adds a little more credibility to your season. But he did total over 4,000 yards. So, what some quarterbacks, lack in rushing yards, he kind of, his rushing yards adds to his passing total. So many back-breaking runs he had, where guys were covered and he was able to make something happen regardless, which is another really big part of his game that really just makes the Titans offense even more dangerous. But, I'm not sure. I think just people have this opinion of Tannehill that they're either, pro Tannehill or anti-Tannehill. There's no middle ground, and I don't know what else he could do until he wins a Super Bowl maybe, or performs better in the playoffs, because he hasn't been great in the playoffs either. I don't think opinions are going to change of him much. He needs that big accomplishment, that next step, before people are going to start having a higher opinion of him.
So let's take it to the offseason now. Who were some of the players? Obviously, some of the absences or the departures are notable. So Corey Davis is out, Jonnu Smith is out, Arthur Smith is out, not because he got fired, rather he gets a new job. So what does that do to the offense? What does that do schematically? What does that do production-wise when you lose 2 of those receiving threats? Jonnu Smith was a player, oh goodness, I would have loved the Cardinals to get him. They weren't going to go out and go spend money on a tight end, though. But yeah, what does that do offensively to them?
Well, this might be a hot take, but I honestly don't think the loss of Arthur Smith is that big a deal. I think the talent the Titans have on offense and, with Tannehill's resurgence, I think had more to do with the Titans' offensive success than Arthur Smith did. Now they're bringing in Todd Downing, who was a tight ends coach last year, and I think he just really, the Titans' approach is very clear. And maybe it changes a little bit with Julio Jones, but you lead with Derrick Henry, and the passing game feeds off of that. So I don't think much changes as far as schematically. Julio will change things. Maybe you can lean on your passing attack a little bit more, but I feel like it's going to be the same approach, and I think that the Titans wanted to keep it similar. That's why they promoted from within. Um, Jonnu Smith is a freak athlete. I mean, the guy is just like he's made in a lab. I mean, physically, he's in great shape, great speed, good blocker. Um, but last year he got off to a hot start, and then once Taylor Lewan went down with a torn ACL, he was asked to block a lot more. They needed the extra help, so his numbers drastically dropped as the year went on. But the Titans' offense just kept rolling, even though he wasn't as involved. So his loss, while a lot of people in Titan circles made a big deal about it, I really honestly don't think it's going to be that big of a deal. I think they'll be able to overcome it, and with the receivers that they have as well, I think they'll be just fine there. Corey Davis, I was sweating that one a little bit more than the other two departures that you mentioned, just because the Titans didn't have a lot of depth in their receiving core. It was AJ Brown, and then it was Josh Reynolds, who could be a good number two, but really has never been anything more than a number three. And then you had rookie Des Fitzpatrick, and then a bunch of unnamed, inexperienced guys beyond them. But now that you have Julio Jones in the mix, now you don't. Losing Corey Davis, who is a very good number two receiver, never emerged as a number one, isn't really as big a deal as it was, before the Julio Jones trade. So honestly, losing all three of those pieces, I think they're going to be just fine without them.
Okay, before we get to the major, you touched on the additions a little bit. Defensively, anybody, the Cardinals know Malcolm Butler is a notable loss. Is there anyone else on defense that was a notable loss? And will you miss, honestly, any of them considering the defensive performance a year ago?
To be honest with you, no. I mean, they lost Malcolm Butler. They cut him. They cut Adoree Jackson. Butler was their best cornerback last year, but even still, they were still terrible defensively. So he didn't really make much of an impact. Adoree Jackson has dealt with injuries the last 2 years, so losing him wasn't a big deal. Clowney did nothing. That was a disaster. Vic Beasley was a disaster. He didn't even make it past week 6. So, I mean, when you look at it, they needed to revamp the defense, and the pieces they lost, I mean, maybe Daquan Jones would be maybe the most impactful, because now they don't really have a nose tackle to replace him at the moment. They're going to depend on, a couple of second-year players and a veteran. But really the pieces that they lost, it's not really that concerning to me. Just after seeing what we saw last year, it was so bad that you really can't say you miss a lot of these guys. And, a lot of them, Butler and Kenny Vaccaro's another one, really endeared themselves to fans over the years. But when you're trying to improve, you got to think with your head, not your heart. And your head tells you that defense was bad last year. So it was time to make changes. And they needed to free up money to make signings, because they were strapped for cash going into the offseason. So they needed to cut Butler. They needed to cut Jackson and all these other guys. It almost became a necessity to have to make the moves that they did.
So we obviously the biggest move, and that's a recent move, is the addition of Julio Jones. The question is he going to, how much impact will he have to where, how much better can the offense be with Julio Jones? And if you're looking at what they were last year, do you think that Jones, with pairing of Jones and Brown, and then Derrick Henry in the backfield, and a new or similar offensive system, do you think that he drastically changes how much better the team is? Obviously, they were great offensively a year ago. Can they be better?
Yeah, I mean, I think at worst, you're looking at an elite offense, and I think at best, you're looking at a step above, which is legendary. I mean, all time. You try to think of ways that you're going to defend this offense, and I just don't see it. I mean, you can stack the box against Derrick Henry, which obviously a lot of teams do, but then you're leaving not much help in the defensive backfield to cover A.J. Brown, Julio Jones, and the rest of the weapons they have. Say you want to double Julio Jones, now or you want to double A.J. Brown, now you're leaving a light box for Derrick Henry to run through. So I think that with at least the way it looks on paper, it's going to be nearly impossible to defend this offense. So I think there is potential to be even better. Like I said, legendary all time, Patriots, Tom Brady, Randy Moss good. I mean, that's how great this offense, I think, has the potential to be. The hype is through the roof for it, understandably. And I think more importantly, the last two playoff exits the Titans have had, the big reason behind them has been the offense has stuttered because Derrick Henry got slowed down or shut down. Now, I think with Julio Jones, you have an offense that the passing attack can carry it. You don't need Derrick Henry to run for 150 yards and 3 touchdowns to win games anymore. He can get shut down, and now you have 2 receivers who can make big plays and can carry your offense in A.J. Brown and Julio Jones. So I think that is one of the bigger things that people aren't talking about, that now you have a passing attack that can carry you, especially in the playoffs when you're facing better defenses that are able to slow down Derrick Henry.
Defensive additions. How do they get better defensively this year?
A lot of talent, but a lot of question marks. They've got to improve the pass rush. They've got to figure out different ways to get pressure. Too many times they were relying on organic pressure last year because they needed to drop extra guys back in coverage. Now they've got better talent in the secondary, I think. Although, like Caleb Farley is a big question mark because of the back. But they've got to do a better job of scheming pressure, more blitzing. Send cornerbacks once in a while, things that they did in 2019 that Dean Pease was a wizard at doing. They've got to do that again. And that's on defensive coordinator Shane Bowen. He did not have a good year last year. Communication was bad. Multiple players complained about communication issues between each other. So, they've got to improve their pass rush first and foremost. We saw what the Bucs were able to do to a team like the Chiefs. I think great pressure is going to be great quarterbacks most of the time. If you can put them on their backs or force them into, rush throws, you're going to have more success. So, the talent is certainly there for them to be improved, and they certainly can't be much worse than they were last year. But they've got to do a better job of getting pressure, and they've got to do a better job in coverage. Those were the 2 biggest problems. And, of course, their third down defense. They've got to get off the field. I can't tell you how many times where they were about to make a big stop, and even 3rd and 10, 3rd and 15, they're allowing completions for first downs. And it was hard to watch.
So the addition of Janoris Jenkins, interesting. A guy who's been in the league for a long time, just makes plays. Bud Dupree, Danico Autry. Where do you see them making big impacts this year?
Well, that's where the question marks come in. So, Bud Dupree is coming off a torn ACL. So, sometimes guys in their first year back from that injury, they're not the same player. But he's got a high motor, a guy who is going to play a lot of snaps and is infinitely better than any pass rusher they had last year and any pass rushers that were returning this year. So I think he makes a big improvement by default just because they really didn't have anybody like that last year, and Harold Landry was seeing a lot of double teams, and he was supposed to be their stud pass rusher. Didn't work out. Danico Autry, I think, is the most underrated addition this year. The Titans defensive line did nothing as far as pressure was concerned last year. And I mentioned Daquan Jones before, just not good at getting pressure. Good run stuffer, but he's not going to get to the quarterback. So when you now put Danico Autry on the defensive line, now you have another guy to take pressure off Jeffrey Simmons. So I think that was one of the most underrated moves that they made. And Jenkins, the Titans made a concerted effort to bring in cornerbacks who can play man coverage. And Jenkins, that's one of the best things that he's able to do. And when you talk about the veteran leadership and the qualities that Jenkins brings, that's something else that a lot of people don't talk about, is how impactful he's going to be on, the slew of young cornerbacks that the Titans have this year.
Coming up next on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web, we continue with our conversation with Mike Moraitis talking about the Titans, their draft class, and their outlook for the 2021 season. That's coming up next on Rise Up C-Red. Their draft class, it was headlined by Caleb Farley, a guy, I will say this, loved. I was in favor of the Cardinals drafting him, even with the concerns of the back. The report that came out after he had his medical recheck, he was a player I would have loved to have. Obviously, there is a risk there. What are you expecting from the draft class this year? Obviously, not everyone's going to contribute, but who do you think are the impact players or the ones who can have some sort of contribution in 2021?
Well, I think the name that comes to mind first is Dylan Redun's their second round pick. He's going to be competing for the starting job at right tackle. He's going to be competing against Ty Sambrailo and Kendall Lamb. Those are two guys who really are career backups. Sambrailo got pushed into a starting role when Taylor Lewan went down last year. I think just based on the standpoint that he's got a chance to win a starting job right off the bat, I think he could be the most impactful, obviously one way or the other, positively or negatively, because you never know what you're going to get out of a rookie. But he really tops the list for me. I think Farley's got a good chance to start, but they don't necessarily need him to start right away. You have Christian Fulton from last year. You have Fulton was their 2020 second round pick last year. You have Jenkins, and then they can kind of rotate guys for the slot. You got Elijah Molden, another draft pick from this year. Farley even has the speed to play in the slot as well. But I think Farley could win a starting job that would push Fulton to the slot. So those guys are really the ones. Fulton, Molden, and Reduns is another one who these guys have the biggest opportunity to make the biggest impact this year. And then guys like Monty Rice, their third round linebacker, Des Fitzpatrick, their fourth round wide receiver, and then you have Rashad Weaver, their fourth round outside linebacker. Those guys are probably looking at limited reserve roles this year, so I don't expect much from them.
So let's look ahead at the Cardinals-Titans matchup in Week 1. How many points do you think might be scored in that game? Obviously, the Titans' offense looks great. The Cardinals' offense was good last year, not even near on the same. It was, for a portion of the middle of the season, was as good as any offense as there was. Now they've upgraded the offensive line. They added A.J. Green. Christian Kirk now moves to the slot. Tennessee, which has big questions defensively. The Cardinals have questions defensively as well. What do you expect to see in this Week 1 matchup?
I mean, I think teams are going to be a lot more prepared to start the season than they were last year. Obviously, you have a better offseason now with more activity, and especially with the 3 preseason games. So teams should be coming out sharper than they did last year. But yeah, I mean, I expect a full offensive explosion Week 1 from both teams. And I've written, in my early review of this matchup, I said this is going to be a great test, not just for the Titans defense, but for the Cardinals defense as well. Really going to see where they are right off the bat and, get a good idea of where they are. But I fully expect this to be, 30 plus points for each team and just, ball getting thrown all over the field. Everybody's running all over the place. And it's going to be a great matchup. And really, another interesting storyline is, Malcolm Butler, coming back to Nashville. He's going to have to guard Julio or A.J. Brown, and that's going to be interesting to see. So, Titans facing J.J. Watt again. A lot of interesting storylines. But the offense of both teams is going to be the biggest one, and we're definitely going to see lots of points in Week 1, I think.
Definitely. I mean, you've got some premier receivers on both teams. You've got Derrick Henry against the very young linebacking core of the Cardinals in the middle with Zaven Collins and Isaiah Simmons, who are basically being given the keys to that defense. I can't wait to see it. It's going to be watch. It's what's a 19-17 game, which would be stupid, but
right. That's the way it would work, But any given Sunday, anything can happen.
But between the star power that there is in Derrick Henry, Julio Jones, and the Cardinals have DeAndre Hopkins, Kyler Murray. Murray obviously gets all the hype. Ryan Tannehill doesn't get enough of it. Right. I can't wait to see what this matchup looks like. And so Mike Moritas, again, this is Mike Moritas from TitansWire.com. He thanks so much for this preview, this rundown of the Titans offseason. This honestly, It's a big test for both teams because there's lots of question marks on both teams right now. And an interesting thing that I saw is that, at least initially, that the Julio Jones addition didn't do much for their chances of winning that week one. I think it moved the line a half a point, and the money line about, I think in the end it ended up moving it about $15 on the money line.
Yeah, there really wasn't a lot of movement. Even in their odds for the division title, they were trailing. They were second behind the Colts, and now they're just tied. I figured that they would go, to the front of the line on that one, but it's really not getting as much respect from some people that I thought it would. So, but it is what it is.
Mike, thank you so much for your time. Again, this is Mike Moritas, the site editor for TitansWire.com, our sister site. Make sure you check out that site, especially leading up to the Week 1 matchup between the Cardinals and the Titans. Coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. We move on to Week 2 to talk about the Minnesota Vikings. That's coming up next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of our Cardinals talk on the web. And we go on to our second of our opponent preview series with Week 2. The Cardinals' home opener is against the Minnesota Vikings. To help us get to know the Vikings a little bit better, I've got Jack White on the line from the managing editor, the site editor from VikingsWire.com. He does what I do, but for the Vikings instead of the Cardinals. Jack, welcome to the show. Thanks for taking some time out of your summer. How you been?
Yeah, thanks, Jess. Thanks for having me on. I've been good. Just hanging in there. It's a Minnesota summer for me, so it's not too bad here. It's been pretty hot recently. It's been in the upper 90s actually, but we're used to a little cooler. So.
Last week was all about 115 and above. The last couple of days has been very pleasant, cloudy, got a little bit of rain, low 100s, pleasant. Now, by the way, this is recorded. So those of you who are listening, this got recorded the week of summer began, so it was the end of June. So yeah, so the weather-wise, it's not the same that what's going on right now. So tell us, Jack, about the last season for the Vikings. What went well for them? What were the disappointments for their season last year, which obviously they were hoping to be a postseason team, but did not make a return to the postseason?
Yeah, so it's easier to start with the disappointments because they started 1-5 and nothing was really going their way. Their pass rush was horrendous. They traded for Unique Ngakoue at the start of the year. He was leading the team in sacks despite only playing 6 games. They ended up trading him to the Ravens. The pass rush struggled all year, and that really affected the coverage unit. And they had guys like Cameron Dantzler, Jeff Gladney, like rookie guys in there. So they were getting burned a bit at the start of the year. And they just couldn't catch a break. Danielle Hunter got a season-ending injury before the start of the year. Anthony Barr got a season-ending injury against the Colts in week 2. It was just a really tough year for depth. It was I think the bet was that, yeah, they're letting Xavier Rhodes go in the offseason of 2020. They're letting Trey Waynes walk too. They're letting these guys walk, but they're going to replace them with rookies. And guys like Justin Jefferson will emerge as stars. And that was true in Jefferson's case, but there was just too many rookies in there. There was just too many guys getting starts who you kind of didn't expect to be playing all that much at the start of the year. And it really affected things. And they kind of just dug themselves too much of a hole that even when they tried to get out of it after the bye week and they rattled off that win streak and kind of got back in the playoff conversation a little bit, they ended up finishing 7-9 just because their margin for error was so small after that 1-5 start.
Right. So, and if you look at statistically, so they had like Dalvin Cook, rushed for over 1,500 yards. Justin Jefferson was fantastic, 1,400 yards, receiving yards. And then you look at Kirk Cousins' numbers. He had 35 touchdown passes over 4,200 yards, a passer rating of 105. I mean, offensively, if you look at the individual performances, you look at it and think that had to be a pretty good team. Obviously, which the defense, which was supposed to be the bread and butter of this team, didn't obviously losing Danielle Hunter and Anthony Barr would hurt. and then having the turnover in the secondary. Essentially, was it the defensive issues, the turnover, and the injuries was what kind of derailed the year?
It has to be, really. It was just the story of the year was like the offense trying to climb back in it, and the defense just not being able to get off the field in time and not being able to create enough turnovers. It was just a lot of defense is Zimmer's calling card, and they've added a lot to try and fix the defense for 2021. That was most of what they put into for free agency. And I just think it just can't really happen again. It's a given that the defense will improve from 2020 because the 2020 defense was so bad in so many different aspects. They really struggled to tackle. They really struggled to cover at times. And I just think that the special teams did them no favors too, giving up block punts, having muffed punts, and fumbles on punt returns. It was just like, you name it, Dan Bailey missing field goals to kind of help them lose that Buccaneers game. You name it, they struggled with it on special teams. And in a lot of different ways, the defense also struggled. So it was just too, the Vikings did too many things that really negatively affect teams to the point where it's just, you look at the elite teams, they're either like the Chiefs, where they have such a good offense that it doesn't matter that their margin for error on defense is small, or, it's like a pretty well-balanced team, like the Browns or something, or like the Steelers, for instance, last year for much of the year. And the Vikings just didn't do that. Their offense wasn't good enough to climb out of the holes that the defense dug for them.
So this has kind of followed Kirk Cousins throughout his career. At this point, what do Vikings fans think of Kirk Cousins, who continues to put up quality numbers, productive numbers, like a top half, better than average top 10, 15 quarterback in the league, but his teams consistently seem too middle? What is the story with Kirk Cousins and the status now? I know we're going to get to the fact that they drafted Kellen Mond this year in a little bit, but what is the view of Kirk Cousins right now?
Yeah, I mean, that's a loaded question when you consider the Vikings fan base. It's just like it varies so much. Like you could ask a Vikings fan and they'd be like, yes, like Kirk's our guy. He's giving us a Super Bowl. And then you ask another Vikings fan and they're like, if I have to watch one more year of Kirk, I'm going to lose it. And it's just like, so here's the deal with Cousins is he's not in the elite echelon of quarterbacks like the Mahomes, like the Brady, like the Rodgers, but he's still pretty good, right? He's still in that Tannehill tier where he can maybe, you'll win more than you lose a lot of times, and you can get to the playoffs and maybe make a run from there. He's on a pretty big contract, which can kind of irk some Vikings fans, and that can kind of make it harder for the Vikings to allocate money to other positions, although they didn't have much of a problem with that this year. They were able to sign a lot of people and maneuver through free agency. But yeah, I think the verdict on Kirk is he's played so many games that this is kind of just who he is. He's going to have games where he wins it for you and he's dominant and he's one of the best quarterbacks that week in the NFL. And then he's going to have games like the one he did against the Falcons where he's just kind of, he'll have time in the pocket and he'll still make a mistake, or he'll just kind of feel the pressure and he'll really struggle under it. And that's kind of just who he is. He's a guy who's great but not elite. And you can build around a guy and you can put him in a place where he can succeed. But
you have to build the roster perfectly for it to work out.
Yes, a lot has to go your way. You almost have to be more lucky than good in a way.
Which we experienced that with, well, pretty much. That was kind of Carson Palmer was kind of the case. Carson Palmer, who was, now granted, I'd put him slightly, like talent-wise, I'd put him above Kirk, but the kind of career that he had was on par. So let's go to the offseason. Obviously, Cardinals fans know that there's a couple additions that y'all made. One being Patrick Peterson and trading for Mason Cole. I don't know what the plans are for Cole on that offensive line, but who are the notable additions in free agency and the notable subtractions from the team this offseason?
Yeah, so let's start with the additions, and let's start with the guys who are going to contribute right away. You got Dalvin Tomlinson, who they signed pretty quickly in free agency. He's probably going to be the starting three-technique defensive tackle. Then, of course, you got, as you mentioned, Peterson. I think with the money they're giving him, he's probably expected to start out wide and have a pretty resurgent year, kind of come back into that pass form he showed with the Cardinals. And then they recently signed Sheldon Richardson, who I think complements that interior defensive line really well, because you got a guy like Tomlinson who can rush the passer every now and then, but he's more of a run stopper. And then you got Michael Pierce, who is, of course, a nose tackle who is much more of a run stopper. So Sheldon Richardson being able to be that penetrating, pass rushing, 3-technique player helps them a lot. You got Bashaud Breeland, who they signed after he played for the Chiefs. He could maybe even start for them at cornerback. He's going to compete with guys like Peterson and Dantzler and Mackenzie Alexander, another guy they signed for those cornerback positions. Those are the names on defense. Oh, they also signed Xavier Woods, who could start at safety. He comes over from the Cowboys. Let's see. Subtractions, they released Riley Reif. He's the big one because he had a pretty good year at left tackle for the Vikings. And they tried to replace him with Christian Darrisaw, first-round pick, who's pretty good at Virginia Tech, but it's not a given that he'll come in and have the year that Reif had in 2020. So that's kind of a risky bet. They released Dan Bailey, but, you could argue that's performance-based. I don't think that's like a huge loss for them. They released Kyle Rudolph, too. So Rudolph has been the mainstay tight end in Vikings territory for quite some time, but they got some good tight ends waiting in the wings. They got Irv Smith Jr., who's been very promising. And they got Tyler Conklin, who filled in with injuries last year and was like a pretty good tight end too. So maybe those two can come in and fill the void that Rudolph left.
And that it's kind of interesting because Patrick Peterson, at least in this case, he's going to a scheme that's probably not going to ask him to do kind of what he's done his whole career, where he said that his bread and butter has been impress man. And but he and Breeland make a really nice veteran pair. And if he is okay with playing a little bit differently than he's done, the tape suggests it might be better because, Peterson, for what I saw last year, he still had elite moments, like for a half, maybe a game, but his lows got pretty low. His bad became bad last year, which is unfortunate. And the Cardinals, honestly, they made no effort to re-sign him. They were ready to move on from him, which was an interesting thing. Coming up next on the Rise Up Sea Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web, we continue our conversation with Jack White and about the Vikings. We talk about their draft class and their outlook for the 2021 season. That's coming up next on Rise Up Sea Red. Now, we go to the draft. Obviously, the top pick there is Christian Darrisaw out of Virginia Tech. Rookie tackle is always a little bit of risky business, always. And then they have a gazillion picks after that. None in the second, but the one that got the most attention was Kellen Mond. Obviously because, well, one, Kirk Cousins probably isn't happy about it. Robert Griffin seemed to suggest as much. But what do you think how do you view the drafting of Mond? How long term is that? Do they view him as potentially a replacement this year or maybe next?
So I think with Mond, it's definitely long term. I mean, you look at his just draft profiles coming out of college, and it's like he definitely has some things he needs to improve on. He was good under pressure. He's shown arm strength, but he could improve a little bit with accuracy, things like that. And I think that's shown a bit from what people have seen from him on the Vikings so far. But he's definitely in the long term a possibility. I don't think it's a given that he'll ever start over Kirk Cousins. I mean, people maybe need to pump the brakes a little bit just because he's a third-round pick. He's a third-round pick for a reason. If all those guys became elite quarterbacks, the third round would be leading to a bunch of NFL teams trying to trade into that spot. But
he's a quarterback that every team passed on at least twice.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. So here's the thing. Kirk Cousins, he's pretty locked in as an established starter this year. If they like Kellen Mond, they could maybe trade Kirk next year or, figure out a solution to move on from him beyond that. But I just think that it's not a given that Mon will ever be a starting caliber quarterback in the NFL. And if he is, I mean, great. Then you got a guy on a rookie contract. You can maybe move on from Kirk Cousins, and you can maybe try to do the opposite of what you've been doing, where you have this quarterback on a big deal and you try to build around that. You could maybe allocate those big deals to other positions and have a rookie QB and, well, a QB on a rookie contract and go from there.
The names on here: Chess Serrata out of North Carolina, Ohio State's Wyatt Davis, Patrick Jones, edge rusher, Kenny Nwangwu, Cameron Bynum, Janarius Robinson, Amir Smith-Marset, Zach Davis, and Jalen Twyman, who unfortunately in the news recently found that he was shot, but will recover. Who are the players outside of Darisaw who you believe will make an impact, even if it's just a complimentary impact in 2021?
Okay, you got to start with Wyatt Davis, just because the Vikings were so bad at guard last year with Dakota Dozier. Dozier's back. He can compete with him for the spot. I would be kind of surprised personally if they win with Dozier over a guy like Wyatt Davis. And there's also a possibility that Mason Cole fills in there. He's taken snaps at guard before. They've got a wide open spot at guard. So, if you're him, you might rather compete for that spot. Or at worst, he's like, the backup center, Mason Cole is. And then Wyatt Davis, let's see. Chess Surratt might become the third linebacker, but my guess is no. I think Nick Vigil, that's probably his spot to lose. Patrick Jones. So I talked a lot about how much the Vikings have revamped this defense. The one opening right now is kind of that spot opposite Danielle Hunter. You got DJ Wanham, who's coming off a decent rookie year. And then you got Stephen Weatherly, who is coming off a pretty bad year with the Panthers. But he reunites with the Vikings. Maybe he can become a starting caliber player. But I actually think Patrick Jones could slot in and start there right away and make an immediate impact. Or they could just sign a guy in free agency, sign an edge rusher or something like that. But, let's see. Of course, Janarius Robinson, for the same reasons as Jones, there's just that opening there. There's question marks with both Weatherly and Wanham. So it's a possibility that he could slot in there as well. Cameron Bynum, that might be a bit of a surprise, but he was a cornerback in college. He's going to make the switch to safety. And there is now that Anthony Harris has signed with the Eagles, there is an opening there kind of next to Harrison Smith. Most people expect Xavier Woods to fill that void. And I think people have said good things about him this offseason so far. That said, he's coming off a bit of a down year with the Cowboys. So it's not a given that he'll be able to slot into that spot right away and be successful. So Bynum's a guy who could maybe at least get reps, something like that. Outside of that, I think like Zach Davidson's more of a project. I think Twyman, he could maybe be a rotational guy. But with Sheldon Richardson, the fact that the Vikings just signed a penetrating three technique, that kind of muddies things there.
So let's look ahead to the 2021 season. This is a team that you would hope can compete for, best case scenario, compete for the division. Ideally looking to make the postseason, kind of like what the Cardinals want to do. What do you see their strengths entering this coming year? What do you think their floor and ceiling is for 2021?
Okay. Strength. Let's go running back for sure. Dalvin Cook and Alexander Madison. That's already one of the best running back rooms in the NFL. Trying to think what else. You got strength at linebacker, I think, too, with those two guys up on the top of the depth chart there, Eric Kendricks and Anthony Barr. Let's go wide receiver with Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen. Can't forget about them. And then floor, I think the floor would be you got Jefferson, you got Thielen. They're both great. But if one of those guys gets injured, all of a sudden you're like Chad Beebe is like your wide receiver too. And like you have to play Beezy Johnson a lot more. And maybe Amir Smith-Marset is great as a rookie, but that's also a risky bet to make. So like I would say their floor is they just get injuries to the offense, which leads to the offense being much worse than what it was in 2020, where Thielen was out for one game, but Kirk, Thielen, Jefferson, Dalvin Cook, they all stayed relatively healthy. They missed games here and there, but like, most of those guys played most of the time. So if any of those guys got a serious injury where it was like, it could be 2020 all over again, but with the offense instead of the defense this time, where guys are getting season-ending injuries, they're getting injured in the offseason, something like that. That could really affect things. That could lead to the revamped defense not mattering much if you can't put up a ton of points.
So kind of how I view the Vikings this coming year would be a window between kind of 6 to 10 or 11 wins. Based like everything, like nothing going right to everything going right. Would that be fair to say that sort of range there?
Yes, I think their ceiling is definitely a playoff team. I think it's a playoff team, maybe even a playoff win, because it's like you look at what they have on paper and it's clearly good. And I'll say this, like I think a lot of teams, if their top players got injured, they would be affected greatly. So I don't think it's like necessarily an indictment on the Vikings that they built their roster like this. But still, it's like, you're pretty top heavy there. So it's definitely a concern. And I also think a lot of what's going to happen with them depends on what the other teams in the NFC North do. Like if the Packers trade Aaron Rodgers, they're the favorites in the NFC North. The Vikings
then
are.
It's wide open. But they'll probably play nice for another year, I'd bet. But
yeah, if I had to guess, I would say so too. And then the Bears, you look at them, if they play Andy Dalton and they go, let's say 2-4, or 2-5 to start the year, and then they go with Justin Fields. It doesn't matter how great Justin Fields is. They may have knocked themselves out of the playoff race right then there. Or if they go with Justin Fields right away and he's the next big thing, all of a sudden the Vikings could theoretically be the third best team in that division.
Yep. So, it is an interesting thing because you got so much in flux with Green Bay, Minnesota, obviously the Vikings with questions, the Bears who you don't know what you're going to get out of them. They got the defense, but can you count on Andy Dalton? And then at least the Lions are the Lions, but at least there's some promise. At least there's some promise to not be awful and boring. They might be awful, but they probably won't be boring. That's kind of how that goes. So, well, we're looking ahead. We're looking forward to that game. I know Patrick Peterson has it marked on his calendar because he says he's going to do what he's going to do.
It's the unofficial Patrick Peterson Bowl.
It is true. That is true. With Mason Cole as the undercard, depending on how that goes.
Yeah. Let's not forget about him.
But thanks again, Jack, for your time. Again, that's Jack White from VikingsWire.com, managing editor there. Go to Vikings Wire for all great Vikings coverage, especially as we lead up to that Week 2 matchup. Coming up next on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web, we will be back with yet our third preview of an opponent. That's coming next on Rise Up C-Red. Next up on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web, we continue with our opponent preview series. And up next is the Cardinals' Week 3 opponent, the Jacksonville Jaguars. And as my special guest for this segment is James Johnson, who runs JaguarsWire.com, our NFL wire site, across the country, down in the AFC South, a division of teams we rarely see. It's been a while, I believe, and so I'm happy to have you on, James. Thanks for joining me on the show. You were just telling me off the air that, about 8-9 years ago, we might have connected for a podcast back then when neither one of us was with USA Today or even thought that USA Today was a possibility.
Yeah, man, it was back when podcasting technology wasn't as savvy as it is now, right? And I can remember it was either through Blog Talk Radio, which is the program we were using, that we saw that you had a Blog Talk Radio show as well, or it was either through another publication that we saw that you worked for. But either way, we reached out to you, and we did connect on a level that like we had set it up. But I don't know, like I think somebody came up on our end or something like that. or it may have been recorded, but it was so long ago
It
I
was
can't
so long
remember.
ago. It's true. It's forever
Right.
ago.
Yeah.
That was a lifetime ago. Let me tell you. But I'm thrilled to have you on. I did this series last off season, and I don't know why I hadn't done it previously, because it gives me two or three extra shows. I usually splice them together to two or three opponents per show, and it gives me a little more content in the off season this time of year, June, July, before training camp, and it gets me to connect with the rest of the editors on our wire, since I'm quite familiar with people out here on the West Coast, but when it comes to the AFC, it is tough to know, and I know Cardinals fans are the same way. We kind of know what's going on out there, and the Jaguars in particular had a notable off season, because we went through the same thing just a couple years ago, going through the whole process of the number one pick. So, welcome, James. Let's talk about the Jaguars and their 2020 season. Obviously, not how you would have drawn it up exactly, but give us the highs and the lows from that season last year, which obviously was less than ideal, but it gives a franchise quarterback moving forward.
Yeah, so 2020 was a season where, if you go by the start of it, which is very odd to see, if you go by the start of it, you were thinking there was some kind of hope. They start off, they win their first game against Phillip Rivers, who's been a thorn in their side, albeit it was with the Chargers, excuse me, before it was with the Colts. But they start off, they win that game, they beat the Colts. That gives you a little bit of hope in terms of the AFC South and how the season's going to go. And then after that, they could just never get it back together, even though they were competitive at times. But I think the way I sum it up in a nutshell, what really hurt them, because the Jaguars, while they weren't a good team, I don't think they were one win bad. But to sum it up in a nutshell, they had some key injuries towards the end of the season. Week 10 and down, they started to really get hit with injuries from that point on. And those injuries were key injuries, guys that had to be placed on IR, like CJ Henderson, who was their first draft pick from last year. They had 2 first round picks, but he was the first one, the cornerback from Florida. Josh Allen went down, and it was just different guys on the defensive side that were really key contributors that could have helped them in a big way, that just went down and that they had to end up putting on IR. And it already wasn't a normal season to begin with the coronavirus pandemic, and how things were operated from a roster perspective that way. So long story short, man, like when the Jets ended up beating the Rams, who you're pretty familiar with, at that point we were like, well, I don't think we want to win any more games, and they didn't, thank God. you know
If you're
thank
gonna
God
be bad, you might as well be bad.
look, if with Trevor Lawrence on the line, man, it was like at this point, man, it's too much at stake if we do win. And that being said, it ended up, going in their way, in terms of losing out during the rest of the season. And, of course, changes had to be made. Dave Caldwell was fired during the season in November. And after the season, that's when Doug Marrone's firing came as well.
So, anybody of note who had a positive year out of that?
Oh yeah, for sure, man. That's the crazy thing about it. When you see 1-15, you're thinking like this team was just horrendous all the way around. But there were actually some good elements that came from it. Laviska Shenault was a guy that a rookie wide receiver that they got from Colorado who balled out last year. He had about 600, 700 yards last year. They kind of used him in a gadget role. And this year he'll be used more so as a receiver, but he showed a lot of promise. And a lot of people, even outside of Jacksonville, like just the national guys, see him as like a breakout candidate after what he did last year. So he was one of the guys that showed promise again. CJ Henderson at times, even though he ended up on IR, he showed promise as well as he showed shades of being a shutdown corner, which is that's huge because of course they traded both AJ Boye and Jalen Ramsey, and they need answers there since both of those guys have been gone. And then it was guys that stood out like Devon Hamilton, another rookie by the way, that was in the same class with Laviska, but Devon Hamilton, nose tackle, he showed flashes when he was available. I think he went on IR at one point too, or he just got injured and just never returned because it was so close to the end of the season. He was a guy that stood out. And like it was a lot of other guys that James Robinson, of course, how could I forget him? Undrafted guy that put up ridiculous amounts of yards and shattered records for undrafted running backs, up there with Dominic Rhodes and guys like that have made history and are in the history books. He's probably the biggest star of them all if you look at it from that perspective. And albeit he had to be placed on IR as well, the good thing about him is he's going to come back fully healthy, and that they got him some help now. So he doesn't have to carry the load as much as he did last year because he carried it at a high rate. In fact, his carry rate was higher than Derrick Henry's, and I believe it was the highest in the league. Ooh. So now they have help for him too, and he's a guy that was able to get them over 1,000 yards last year and just do some all around things as well in the passing game as well and help them.
So now with that, those are some nice pieces. That it feels like they are in a better spot talent-wise than the Cardinals were in 2018, because after the 2018 season, while they felt they basically cleaned house, and it was anything, even some of the positive things, they kind of cleaned house, and anything with the stink of 2018 on them, they were gotten rid of. Even the linebacker Josh Bynes, he was perhaps their best defender that year. They didn't want him back. They just wanted to clean house completely. Now, they bring in Urban Meyer, famous in the college coaching, very successful college coach, now getting a chance in the NFL. We've seen, obviously, this is a different story. This is more of like when Nick Saban got hired, when Chip Kelly got hired, not like when Cliff Kingsbury got hired for the Cardinals, who was a middling head coach in college. What do you think of what Urban Meyer has done so far, and do you think he can be successful in the NFL?
That's a great question in terms of what has he done so far, because it ties into basically the note that we left off on the last question, and that being that the Jaguars are in a better shape or in a better predicament than their record from last year looks. And one thing about Urban Meyer is, and he's always been this way, dating back to his time as a college coach. But his whole theme is, hey, look, I'm going to take what we have and we're going to win with it regardless. And for the most part, now we don't know if that's going to work on the NFL level, but for the most part, it has worked. At Bowling Green, he just took what he had, Alex Smith and company, and ran with it and was successful. And that's why he built such a name on the college realm. And that's why he's reached the NFL level at this point, is because like literally everything he's touched, he's turned, not so good teams into great teams. And, from, like I said, from when he was with the Falcons at Bowling Green, and from his time at Utah with Alex Smith, from his time with the Gators, from his time with Ohio State. Now, the Gators and Ohio State weren't in bad shape when he got there, but he did take them to new heights. So I guess they aren't the same as, the other teams that he's worked with.
But he elevates every team that he's coached so far.
Exactly. Made Florida a championship level team. They went to 2 championships and did it one time with Ohio State. So you're right. You hit the nail on the head. He's elevated teams, and that's what Urban Meyer could bring to the Jacksonville Jaguars. That's what Shad Khan believes he could do. But more so, like, Urban Meyer is a good, you know what I'm saying? Say what you like about him. And I was one of the people skeptical on bringing him in too, but he's a great overseer. And that's why the Jaguars brought him into the equation, is because while he doesn't have experience on the NFL level, he's a good overseer that would build his team and concoct this team with notables from the NFL level that have had success on the NFL level, like your Darrell Belvels of the world, like Brian Schottenheimer, who has worked with young quarterbacks in the past, like he'll be doing with the Jacksonville Jaguars. And he basically is the overseer of a organization or a roster more so than a head coach. So he's the guy that basically can get you the guys that you need to win and so on and so forth. And he just oversees the process. So it's a little bit different than like viewing him as a head coach, but nonetheless, you can understand why Shad Khan would want Urban Meyer in the equation, just based off of all of those things that I've said in the past about his ability to win and get the right people into the mix to help him win.
And he should get the fan base fired up there in Florida, considering considering the history that he has there. So, was there anyone of note after 2018 when the Cardinals let a number of players go? It really wasn't anybody of note. Was there anybody impactful who has left in free agency this year?
Yeah, that was the good thing about it, was like it wasn't really a lot of guys that like, I mean, it was, of course, when you're 1-16, just about anybody you lose is probably significant. So it was guys like Keelan Cole, who, that's not a knock on Keelan Cole because he was a good receiver for the Jaguars. But when we lost him, we had a lot of concerns like, hey man, we just lost a guy that did some great things for us. That was one of Dave Caldwell's best finds as an undrafted free agent, rookie free agent. I think he had been there since, I think his first year was 2017. So they lost Keelan Cole, but at the same time, like the thing that Urban Meyer did was, I mean, and people shouldn't have really been concerned, because if it's one thing that Urban Meyer knows, it's the receiver position. So, he went and got some guys like, and these might not be names that really, really get anybody hyped up or whatever the case may be, like Philip Dorsett and Michael Agnew, but they are speed guys. And I'm sure they probably had took an attempt at trying to get Curtis Samuel as well, because obviously the Urban Meyer connection, Ohio State, he played for Urban. But ultimately the Washington football team ended up getting him. So, like when, basically when Keelan Cole is, the biggest name that, and I think his name is escaping me too. They lost a tight end who was on a 1-year option. But, when those guys are your guys, your biggest guys that you lost, and, in terms of what you lost from last year, that's not really a big deal. And I don't think anybody was really concerned about the losses. It wasn't a significant amount of losses like it was in 2020, when the Jaguars they forced the losses on themselves, trading away Calais Campbell, trading away AJ Boye, trading away all of these blue chip guys. That was by choice. And really, with this situation that Urban Meyer inherited, it was some guys that were just at the end of their contracts that, while, they were contributors, at the same time, they wouldn't be hard to replace.
Cut on next on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best era of Cardinals talk on the web. We continue the conversation with James Johnson about the Jaguars, moving on to their free agency, draft class, and their outlook for the upcoming season. That's coming on next on Rise Up C-Red. So, Jags come into free agents with a ton of money. Who are the most significant additions that they've made to their team? I know that they added big on the offensive line. They really wanted to shore up defensively. Who are the big guys that they added who should be major players in the 2021 season?
Yeah, my bad, Jess. I had to close my door real quick. But yeah, in terms of the big guys that they added, Shaquille Griffin, who I'm sure you're familiar with,
yes,
over there in the NFC, was a big one for them, because, like, to be honest with you, when free agency started, they weren't signing a lot of big names, and it concerned people, and people are still kind of concerned about it. But towards the that second, third day window, they started to get some more notable names in there. But Shaquille Griffin is a big one for them. Again, going back to what I was saying earlier, they needed somebody to replace AJ Boye and Jalen Ramsey, who was probably the best cornerback tandem duo in the league at the time, and also one of the better duos in terms of Jags history. It probably is the best duo in Jags history. So they needed some help to pair with CJ Henderson as well, who again went on IR. So they got Shaquille Griffin, and that seems like it wasn't all that hard to do, because Shaquille Griffin is a Florida kid. Him and Urban Meyer have the same degree of love for the state of Florida, and that made it kind of easy. Even though Urban Meyer did not know him personally, that still kind of made it easy, because Urban Meyer, that's the thing about him, if he doesn't know you, he knows somebody that does know you, and those people, those mutual connections, help him to, mend together whatever he's trying to mend together. And in this case, it was his former wide receiver, Louis Murphy, who was familiar with Shaquille Griffin. And then the other big one for me is Roy Roberts Harrison, who is the guy that, Roy Robertson Harris, who is a defensive lineman that they got from the Chicago Bears. They'll use more 34 concepts this year, even though they're going to be multiple. They're going to use 4-3 looks as well. But he's going to really play that defensive end position in the 3-4. Probably could play defensive tackle in the 4-3, which will help tremendously. He was one of those kind of underrated guys that you kind of circle when you're looking at free agency and saying he could be a guy that don't cost you a lot of money, but still a guy that could actually be an upgrade for the team. That's exactly what he is for the Jacksonville Jaguars, and if he could stay 100% healthy, I think he missed about half of the games last year with the Bears. If he can stay healthy, he's the guy that can help their defense tremendously improve, because they were in the bottom of the league in a lot of key categories defensively, which that kind of helped them to project them to Trevor Lawrence.
True. We look forward to moving forward to the draft. And now we have, obviously, they go into the first round with the top pick, and then the pick that they got from the Rams for Jalen Ramsey. And you get Trevor Lawrence and you get Travis Etienne, two dynamic players. What is the expectation of Lawrence in year one? What would be reasonable to expect from him?
Yeah, that's another good question. So, like, in terms of what to expect from Lawrence, because people forget, like, even with him being as talented as he is, right? This is a team that only won one game last season. Again, but as I said, also, they weren't a team that were a one-win team either. If you look at the bones of the roster, they were better than that. Not necessarily a good team, but they were significantly better than their record showed. So, that being said, for the Jacksonville Jaguars and the acquisition of Trevor Lawrence, I think, like 6 wins is what they're looking at. And for him, I feel like in the beginning for him, it's a chance that, like he may, struggle a little bit to find his feet, because what I was getting at is when Andrew Luck was in the league, his first rookie season wasn't all that great either, but they had enough around him to make it work out and for them to be successful. This is a little bit different, in terms of what the Jaguars had, albeit their offense is in way better shape than their defense. But I think, like, in the beginning, he could struggle a little bit. But at the same time, like, eventually he'll find his footing, because Darrell Bevell has done this before. That's the offensive coordinator with Russell Wilson. He coached him as a rookie and beyond. So, like, I think they could really catch steam towards the middle of the season or late in the season. But for Trevor Lawrence, I think, like, what would be respectable for him is, to have the offense in, most of the games that they play in, and not being blown out. And I think, like, for the most part, he'll be able to do that because there are a lot of weapons, again, as I was saying, on offense. He has a Laviska Shenault. He has DJ Chark. His receiving core is pretty good when you look at it from that perspective. They also added Marvin Jones in free agency. They have Colin Johnson, who showed promise last year. He just doesn't have that safety blanket type of tight end that some of these guys have had as rookies. That's arguably one of their weakest spots. But again, when you have the kind of depth they have at receiver, maybe they can make up for it. He has a veteran offensive line in front of him. That's a good part about it as well. Cam Robinson's coming back, albeit, a lot of people are mixed on how they feel about him. He's better than, some of the options that they could have gotten out of free agency, or most of them, if not all of them, aside from like Trent Williams. So, they really didn't downgrade there. That he's got guys like Brandon Linder, who is really a Pro Bowl caliber center. His thing is just, staying healthy. And again, as we said, James Robinson, you have the run game to protect him early in the year if you need it. And the guy in Travis Etienne that you also mentioned, that's just explosive. And he's going to be kind of like the Percy Harvin for Urban Meyer, if you will. So, like, just long as he's keeping them in games, especially in the beginning part of the season, I think it'll start to click, halfway down the road. And like at the end of the season, he can finish strong. So that's how I'm feeling about him right now.
And honestly, when I looked at the schedule, that was one of the things that I liked about the Cardinals schedule, is that they get to face Jacksonville early before Lawrence has really gotten to be able to get his feet under him yet. And so I think that bodes well for Arizona in that. Now, obviously, the big two names are Trevor Lawrence, Travis Etienne. Do you see are there any other draft picks or rookies that you see making a significant contribution or complementary role this year?
Yeah, one of their second round picks. They had two second round picks as well. One of them being Tyson Campbell from Georgia, and I would know him very well because I'm a Georgia fan. So yeah, Tyson Campbell is a guy that, while it's kind of hard to see where he's going to be in this secondary. Clearly, when you draft somebody that high in the draft, the first second round pick in the entire draft, pick number 33, you have plans for him, and their plans. Just how Urban Meyer explained it is like he's a guy that they see as multiple and can play at different parts of the secondary. And that is important because if you look at, their defensive coordinator, who is Joe Cullen, he's coming from the Baltimore Ravens. That's very fitting because the Baltimore Ravens are a team that use their defensive backs in a multiple way. One day some of these guys are playing corner, then the next day some of them playing, that same person's playing nickel or safety. Like they just move around all over the place. So that indicates that Tyson Campbell, who they feel is a very multiple defensive back, will get a lot of play time on the field. And the other guy is another defensive back, coincidentally, Andre Cisco, who was their third round pick, who they got from Syracuse as well. This guy put up crazy production as a rookie, or excuse me, as a collegiate player. Especially, his, last 2 to 3 years. I think he got 12 interceptions. But he tore his ACL last year. Unfortunately, didn't get to play a lot last year. But before that, he was able to be highly productive. 12 interceptions. You need that kind of ball hawk when you look at like the Baltimore Ravens model of defense and where Joe Cullen is coming from. You need that in the backfield, and he gives them that. And that's something that they really haven't had in a long time since, the days of having basically, Barry Church and having Tashawn Gibson, who were also a part of that pair with AJ Boye and Jalen Ramsey. So I think those two guys will definitely make an impact for them as well. But the other guys are guys that, probably will be, guys that help them later down the road, like Walker Little. He probably won't start this year, obviously, with Cam Robinson starting at left tackle. And they also have a pass rusher they drafted as well by the last name of Smith. He'll be in the rotation, but again, like he probably won't be able to have an impact like the rest of the guys. But in terms of immediate impact guys, it's definitely the two defensive backs I named.
Awesome. So we look ahead to the 2021 season. You've already said that you'd kind of like to target about 6 wins, and that's kind of what the Cardinals did. So they went from 3-13 to 5-10-1. They picked up a tie in that season opener. What do you look forward to in the matchup between the Jaguars and the Cardinals in Week 3? No predictions or anything, but what do you like about that matchup?
Well, what I like about the matchup is what can probably hurt them the most in the game, and that's the fact that they play Kyler Murray. Because you look at how they open up, they open up against Houston, Vegas has them winning that one. I think most people have them winning that one, despite the season they're coming off of. And then they play Denver after that, if I can recall. And, like it's mixed in terms of not necessarily who people think will win, but what how that game will look for the Jacksonville Jaguars. A lot of people think the Jacksonville Jaguars will fare well in that game, not necessarily win it, but really the Cardinals are the first big test they get. And, the Cardinals are a team that's of playoff caliber. I know they haven't made the playoffs the last few years. So
kick away from the playoffs last year.
Right. But I think to your credit, I think they make it this year. They've always.
That's the hope. That's the hope. I think that's kind of the trajectory they need to do to maintain what they're doing.
Right. And I like Cliff Kingsbury, and I like his, his marriage with Kyler Murray. And again, like, that's something the Jaguars need to see is a quarterback that explosive because, that's what, the league is moving to. But that's what they need to see because when you, again, looking at the statistics they put up defensively last year, they were last or close to last in a lot of key categories. And I really do think Kyler Murray, if they don't handle that situation well, the Cardinals can drop a lot of points on them. And that being said, like just the all-around roster of the Cardinals as well, though, like they have great receivers. I know like they've been collecting receivers over the last 2 or 3 years. They're getting better, very, very, very athletic on the defensive side of the ball. When you look at, what they've done there, Savion Collins, Buda Baker, they got some playmakers on that side as well. And that being said, like with that being the first big test for the Jacksonville Jaguars, which a lot of us will admit we don't think is going to go all that well, we do want to know, how they fare against teams of that magnitude, of that playoff magnitude, or one of those teams that are knocking on the door of the playoffs, because that'll be an early gauge of how much this team has improved from last year to this year.
And that will wrap up this preview of the Jaguars. James, thank you so much for your time. That's James Johnson from JaguarsWire.com. You should definitely visit that site, especially leading up to the Cardinals Week 3 matchup there. Get to know what the Jags have done this offseason, what they're looking forward to. And I appreciate the time, James. And that concludes this edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast, episode 311. And we'll be back again with another episode soon to preview the Arizona Cardinals' next few opponents, starting with the LA Rams, whom they will face in Week 4. Thanks again for listening, and as always, pay attention to when the next episode drops. Thanks for listening, and go Cardinals. Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be Red, See Red, and of course, Rise Up, See Red.